warm welcome to a cornucopia of Tales and Tellers. Today we've got a very special episode because there are four of us in the Zoom room to record this episode, and it's going to be a discussion about a theme that nobody knows about. So just Alan and I know what we're going to talk about. And hello, Alan.
Hello, everybody.
Whereas David, hello, David.
Hello. Yes, it's a bit of a mystery.
And Despina, hello, Despina.
Hello, guys. We're just left here clueless. No idea what's going to follow.
Yes, they have no clue what we're going to talk about. And that was all Alan's idea. But he said, well, they're storytellers. They can think of something to say on the go. So if you don't have
in Irish,
anything
we
to
say
say,
wing
it's
it.
going to be Alan's fault. Let's see.
So the first thing, this is part two of an episode we did a couple of weeks ago called "Catching Rainbows and Emergency Glue." So the first story I told was a story about a guy who finds a horse in the Glens of Antrim, and the horse is trapped by the King Ferry, and he has to do several little tasks to release the horse, basically. And they all lived happily ever after. Simona, what was the two stories you had?
I had two stories. One about a fish who had to be helped by a wizard to get rid of something he had eaten and he shouldn't have. And the other story was about a little robot who kept emergency glue in his stomach pocket. And Alan was very happy about that story. He always laughs whenever he remembers that story. So these were the two stories I told.
I love the idea of just a robot going along with a sandwich in his chest just to take it out to eat it, which would put it back in his chest, which means he could take it out to eat it. It's a cycle of sandwiches. Yeah. So on the podcast, we basically asked for feedback, and we got some interesting feedback. For example, some people said the stories were stories, but they didn't strike us as stories we would normally tell. Or the people who heard them and sent us feedback said the stories were interesting, but maybe they were either too long or they just didn't match the personalities of us telling them. So we would be quite interested, David and Despina, of what you thought of the contents of those stories. And I don't mean the contents of the robot's chest. I mean the contents in general. Of what you heard. Did they feel like natural stories? Did they come across as ye old folk tales?
Well, I thought for me it was different in your two different cases. I thought Simona's two stories came across as kind of authored stories that weren't necessarily traditional stories, although they had traditional story elements in them. Whereas your story, Alan, I thought was either a traditional story or like a traditional story or based on a traditional story. And it reminded me of, to some extent, of one particular Irish story I've heard and even told before, which is, do you know the story where there's the tailor of Galway who sets off to Dublin because the king has been ousted by gosh, it's such a long time since I've told it. Is it a giant? I think it's a giant that's taken over the castle.
Right.
And
it's not familiar.
And the tailor needs three helpers, and one of them is a horse. But he digs a hole for the horse to hide in, and the horse helps him in exchange. But in the end, he doesn't help the horse get out of the hole. So it's a bit of a problem with a horse in a hole.
We've all had those problems around here. Despina, what was your take on it?
I too had a different sentimental reaction to each tale, not necessarily the difference between you two, the difference between each of the three tales. So the first one, the one with the horse, is one of my favorites, firstly because of the magical element in it, and secondly, it's the motif that the hero has to pass through all the tests So this is like the process of maturity, and this is a very common theme in different genres. So I really like that, even though the horse topic always brings kelpies in my mind, which are not always pleasant beings in fairy tales, but this one was nice. And then the fish tale was very funny, of course. So usually in these things, you start with the hero doing something silly, and afterwards, supposedly, they receive a life lesson through their experience, but not in this case. So that was, the line you were not expecting in the end. That was fun. Now, when it comes to the robot story, I could follow it. I liked the sequence of events, but when the robot word was mentioned, it always brought me to a modern era. And I prefer tales to be timeless. So I think if I were to tell this tale, I would probably change the robot into something else, maybe a wooden doll or, something like that.
Yeah, because I think when you introduced it to someone, I think originally I thought you were going to tell Pinocchio. Well, that was what I imagined anyway. Pinocchio with a lunchbox in his chest.
Ah, yes.
Maybe we had talked about Pinocchio or Geppetto beforehand or something. But anyway, so now I think it's time for the bombshell. Dun dun dun. So basically, we told those stories, and I think we worded the stories that they were recent to us. Well, technically speaking, the stories were recent to the entire universe because they were the best part of 15 minutes old, something like that. So what we had done was preparing for the podcast. We had actually sat on Zoom together, and I had sat on, through trial and error, mainly error. I had sat on, you've probably heard of Chat GPT by now. So what I had done with my story was I had told the AI to give me a folkloric, I think that was the words I used, folkloric Irish tale. So it gave me the skeleton of my tale, and it said, and then the person needed to do these three things, and then he came back. So it's like, okay, so what are the three things? So I had like a very thin skeleton of the story, and then I kept asking it to put more and more meat on it, more and more meat on it, and then I culturized it. Is that a word? I had the skeleton, and then I sort of tried to turn it into my own tale, as it were. Simona, what had you done?
So basically, well, my stories were not created by artificial intelligence, but by my own mind, because I created them with a game that I've got. So it's a storytelling game. You've got cards and 5 categories, and there are some cards for each category. So there is main character, problem, enemy. These are the categories. So I took one card for each category, and then I had to put them together. So that's why there was a robot inside the story, and there was a glass shoe, a glass made of crystal, and so it felt really Cinderella with a glass shoe, but then there was a robot, so I had to use my brain to have them to create a sense and have them make sense actually. So we tried these 2 techniques, let's say, to create new stories, and we wanted to see the difference between something that was created by artificial intelligence and something that was created by a human mind, but with constraints. So I had to act with the constraints of the game, because I had those, I had that character, I had that lesson that needed to be learned. So in the case of the fish, for example, Despina, you said the fish made a mistake, understood the lesson, and then made the mistake again. So basically, the lesson, the moral of the story had to be sometimes things go back just where they started. So I had this constraint, and I had to create a cycle. So I started from the problem, and then he solved the problem, but then the problem I had to go back to the problem again. So I made the fish swallow the ring again. So these were the things that we did.
I think when we say it out loud, it sounds like we were actually the students in an English classroom, doesn't it? Because here's the skeleton. How can you turn it your own? So we'd be interested to know from you guys. Does that change the story? Does it change telling it? Does it change the meaning of it? Does it change the feel towards it, or is it sort of just text on a screen now?
I'd actually wondered about. I mean, you hit it as a bombshell. I wasn't surprised to find out about the Chat GPT, because I've been hearing a lot about it recently. But I'd imagined that both of you had used it. And isn't it interesting? Yeah, that the one, you asked for an Irish folk traditional tale, and it came up with that, and then with further prompts, you got the further detail. Yeah, that kind of makes sense to me. And yeah, I hadn't guessed about Simona using a kind of story making game, but that makes perfect sense as you explain it. And you used that for both of the stories, right? Yeah.
Yes.
And then you were putting that. I feel I admire you for keeping to that constraint, because I think my temptation would have been to say, "Oh, I'll stay with what it's got, but I'll make some changes to it as well and use it as a frame." But you were quite strict with yourself,
Yes.
And the actual idea of this not learning and coming back to where you started, that was a constraint right from the beginning with the story, right? Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
because one of the 5 things that you select at the beginning is the moral of the story. So everything needs to make sense based on that moral. So that was a constraint for me. And actually, when we wanted to record the episode, when we decided to record the episode, it should have been all ChatGPT stories. But ChatGPT was banned in Italy for a few weeks or months. And so I said, well, I've got this game. I'll do it like that. And we changed it a little bit. And
I think we had an issue because when we were preparing for it, there was so much trial and error going, no, don't like that. No, don't like that. No, don't like that. And then it was borderline racist because it kept calling all of my characters Seamus. There was some borderline alcoholism in the thing as well, which I didn't like and took out. But yeah, we definitely had to turn the tales into our own as well. It was like, here's your thin skeleton. I try and prompt the like, for example, in mine, getting it to, trying to get the 3 ideas for, catching a rainbow and all the other stuff. That was more creativity rather than AI doing it. It just couldn't handle that. But I never want to see a story with Seamus in it again, who has a drinking problem. I mean, it's getting that from somewhere. I don't know who's inputting that, but did they feel like stories? I mean, a lot of people, some of the feedback we got was it didn't sound like stories you would tell, which I think is interesting. Maybe I've stereotyped myself in what I tell.
When people say that, perhaps they are already familiar with the idea that you have used such a device. I mean, I had no idea what you used to make the stories. I didn't even know the stories were yours. So they did sound like stories to me. However, that is totally subjective, I guess. On the other hand, now you get to compare and contrast the 2 different tools you used. So that's interesting. But when it comes to changing the story, going back to your first question, Alan, whether it changes the story in ways it shouldn't or something like that, I have devised the term Despina is for my personal use, so you feel free to use it. You can Alanize the story, or you can Simonize the story, Davidize the story. So I always do that. In fact, what I do is a part of what you did. So I take the story, I take out the meat, keep the bones, and either shuffle the meat around or change it. So it has to do, of course, with the moral of the story you want to pass, the message, what message you want to people to get, but also sometimes in tales, especially if they're folk tales coming from decades past, well, things were different then. The place of women in society was very different, and we need to show how things were, of course, yes, but we also want to show how we would like things to be. So I sometimes revise the sexes of the main characters in the story. I have the woman not being a damsel in distress, but actually becoming an active part of the story, saving herself, or sometimes she becomes the heroine and she saves others. So I think that is essential as well.
Do you think it's always the case with stories then that, I mean, I don't think I've ever told the same story twice. I've always added or taken away or changed a bit. As long as the skeleton is always there, like you said, I've always, I suppose, Alanized it. I probably said cultureized it. So yeah, I think it's a case of we always do that anyway, don't we? So it's always evolving. Yeah.
It is how the different versions we have today came to be. It's part of the storytelling process. It's part of what we do. And then, of course, you have the same story in different cultures, and then you can see the similarities and the differences between places through a far distance on the globe, but it is the same story, essentially. So I think we should create our own versions. What do you think, David?
Yeah, I agree with everything you've said, Despina. I think there are stories, I mean, the most common significant change I make to traditional stories is exactly what you're talking about. It's about gender. But there are sometimes stories where it's so deeply ingrained in the story, I just think, like, I'm not going to be retelling that story with any audience I come across. But very often there is a way of giving agency to the female character, which is not there in the traditional version. But I think this is, I'm kind of interested in the whole story making process as well, the story and the techniques. And I don't think it really matters whether we're using ChatGPT or a game to create a story. I think it's just finding what works. And if we're all English language teachers, I think those are interesting things to explore. I mean, my favorite way of creating stories with students is creating stories collaboratively in a group or with a whole class, and then students taking that very roughly collaborated and created story and then reworking it, so they then individualize it. That's one of my favorite things to do. Or that once we've created a story together as a group and we've set that kind of frame, that then they go into groups and create stories using similar tricks. So I suppose with ChatGPT, that could be done in group work. I guess with I mean, I haven't explored ChatGPT. I tried to use it once. I mentioned in the pre-chat that I'm writing an article about mixed language storytelling, and I did a webinar on it a couple of weeks ago. And I thought, oh, what I'll do is I'll see if I can turn the transcript of my talk into an article. And I talked to my son, Tom, and I said, how would I do this? And he said, well, just put it into ChatGPT, the transcript, and give it the prompt, write an article in the style of David Heathfield. And it didn't work. And it's because I haven't used ChatGPT. I don't know how to do the prompts yet properly. Tom's coming to visit next week, and perhaps I'll explore it a bit further. But he's using ChatGPT. I mean, he's an instant adapter of all new technology, and he's using it all the time in his work. He's literally taking it and running with it. So I mean, I'm curious at how it's going to develop. And I guess, the tool is only ever as good as the person using it. I guess it's going to be like that for a while. I am worried, though, about ChatGPT or AI taking over the world, although I've been assured by experts that that's not going to happen. But I do fear that we're going to be wiped out one day. And I had a really interesting conversation with Nick Emery, who some of us know. And we were talking precisely about this, and he was speculating, but quite confidently, that it won't be very many years before teachers are practically redundant in terms of content of what we're teaching, and our role will be on building communities and maintaining communities and a kind of good atmosphere for learning. So he thinks that storytelling will remain there as a key part of what people need. But actually, when it comes to learning grammar and vocabulary, no, AI will be doing all of that. I don't know.
Well,
There's a lot of ideas to
I
think
think I
about.
prefer that.
I don't know. I'm connecting to what you were saying, David. I was listening to a podcast yesterday, and I don't know if you're familiar with the History Hit podcasts. There are various podcasts about history, and there's this podcast about the history of inventions. It's called Patented. And I was listening to an episode about spam, so the birth of spam and spam emails and in chats. And the final thought of the person who was interviewed um, really struck me because I thought, well, tomorrow I'm recording an episode about storytelling and the use of AI in storytelling. And what he said was really important for me because he said he was talking about the future of AI and if we need to be scared or not. He said, I think that in the next few years or decades, everything will be an epistemological problem. So what we see online, is it true or is it false? Is this article written by the person that I think it was written by, or by artificial intelligence? Is this person talking on the phone with me a true person or a computer? Is this podcast made by a true person or by a computer? And all these things. And what he said was, I think there will be a revival, and we'll need more things that create communities and that we can see as real and as human. And I thought, well, I really hope that will happen because storytelling is exactly that. So, telling a story, you tell something about yourself, you give someone else, someone that you've received or you made up, be it a folktale that you've learned or something that you're creating. And it's personal, it's human, and it creates communities because if whether I'm sharing a story with one person or a group of people, you share something human in the telling of a story. So I don't know. He said this, and I said, "This is really important. This is really a good thought, and this is also why storytelling is always more important in a AI-led word, as I was telling Alan before. I don't know if this can describe what the word will be like. AI-led. I don't know.
Well, it makes sense if you consider that knowledge like that would be linear. I mean, when we are telling to students, there's always this triangle formed. So there's a story, there's a teller, and there's the audience who get it. So this is like a connection, which I don't think can be replaced in any other way, because part of it would be missing. Yeah, I think in pictures, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. But if you think about Alan's story, Alan used ChatGPT to generate a story and through asking question prompts, but essentially you then took it and made it into your own story and retold it, and it worked. So it's just a tool. It's yes, I suppose it's where do we, where we go from here, and whether at some point it will be doing something else. But you were still the storyteller, very much as however the story comes to us, we're the ones who select and filter out what we don't want and add in what we do want to convey, and it speaks for itself. We're storytellers.
Yeah, I think it's that thing where it is just an assistance. I know the media, when they're talking about artificial intelligence stuff, basically what it boils down to, I think, is people have watched Terminator 2 far too much. And it is just an assistant tool. But I think are we different because we're storytellers as well? Because if I'm introduced in a story that I'm telling, say, in person or whatever, I go, here's one I heard from, or when we do this podcast, it's like we got a story from whatever, and there's no sort of copyright or anything on that. Whereas because that was done in AI, there's obviously going to be a background history, something of the skeleton of that tale, or 400 versions of it. Because Despina mentioned it there. Who then owns that story? Does anybody own that story? Do we ever own stories?
ChatGPT is mining millions of bits of information, isn't it? And you've asked it to create an Irish folktale, so it's taken in all that information plus extra kind of stereotype information about alcohol and Seamus, etc. But in a way, it's very truthful. It's kind of got this kind of huge history of Irish knowledge of folklore, I guess. So it's kind of like a traditional Irish folktale, but it certainly doesn't belong to anybody but you. I mean, how could it can't belong to ChatGPT or the makers of ChatGPT, because that's just a collation of information that's existing.
Well, if you set the greater picture, I don't think stories can be owned. I mean, yeah, you put part of yourself in them, and you try to pass one particular message. But if I make a story, if I create it and I go out there and tell it, I expect people who like it to take it, make it their own and retell it. That would be part of handing it over to others. I would like that to happen. Not necessarily my name mentioned every time. It wouldn't matter. Storytellers do not have a big ego. That is why we're not actors. Yeah. And I know that AI might be intimidating, as new technology always is, but David, I am adamant in my belief that if we at some point reach our own demise, it will be of our own making.
Yeah, I always used to have the phrase when I used to teach computer science, the issue is normally between the keyboard and the chair. It's in there. Yeah. Because I think it's one of those things, because it was storytelling, when I did my qualification course, it was basically avoid published material. Because when finances and publications come into it, then it becomes a bit of a more grey area and sort of legal thing. Whereas generally, everything we've done has always just been word of mouth, really, isn't it?
Well,
does that keep us in the clear?
Depends on what kind of learner you are. Yeah, there are people who prefer to read something, and there are people who prefer to listen to something. We learn in different ways, so any one of the two that works.
Can I ask you a question about Simona's way of learning your two stories, or creating your two stories, I should say, rather than learning? Because again, it was just using tools, and I've not recently, I must admit, a long time ago, tried using some story making games with students. But the problem I always ran into were that there were too many prompts. That there was the games always had too many ideas, and in a way, the best or usual traditional stories have very few key ideas, and then you expand from those. There's the one magical element, there's one helper, and there's one central protagonist, but we don't need very much. And these kind of games with cards or with dice or whatever, they seem to generate too much. Is that an issue that you've run into when you've created a story yourself or done similar things with your learners?
Not really when I created these stories, because there are really just 5 elements in this game. So it's I don't know if you're surely familiar with the game where you give certain elements, and the students need to try to put them together in their story. For example, you give them an orange, a candle, a horse. Um, some wheat, and I don't know, a house. And they need to create a story including those elements. And the funny thing is to see if they create a story, similar stories, or different stories. So with me, with this game, it was really simple, because the structure of the game is just I give you 5 elements, and you create a story that makes sense. So the 5 elements are a character, um, an object that can be positive or negative depending on what you want it to be. There's location, let's say, place that can be either the ocean for the fish story, and the bridge for the robot story. Then there's an enemy, or a helper, depending on whether it's a good person or a bad person in the cards. And then you've got the moral of the story. So with this game, it was really, really simple, because it's a game that you play in 2 people. So you have all the cards down on the table. You take 5, and then the first one who you exchange a card, and you take another one. You exchange a card, and you take another one. The first one who has all the 5 elements in their hands, can tell a story, and the other needs to give a mark based on the story. So it's a really simple game. But I had the same problem with another game that I have. I've got dice, storytelling dice, or story making, I should say, story making dice. And I use them in a way that's not the right way to use them, because if you follow the instructions, it's too complicated. I think there are too many elements. What I usually do is there are 6 dice. I get them to throw the dice, and then they've got 1 element for each dice, for each die, and they need to create a story from that. Because if you follow the instructions, it says, okay, for the first part of the story, these are the elements. And then let's roll the yellow die, and let's see what comes into the story at this point of the story. And then by the end of the story, you've got something like 20 elements, and you need to put all the elements inside the story. So I'm not using the instructions. I'm changing them, because, as you said, there are too many things. But maybe you're referring also to something like Dungeons and Dragons. So that's role play game, and you need to create a story, and then the characters of the story play the game based on the story that you're creating, based on the setting and the things that happen. So maybe that's kind of more complicated, and I wouldn't use something like that in the classroom unless my students were familiar with that kind of game. But I don't know if you're referring to something like that, David.
To be honest, I've done those games very little, but I kind of abandoned them very quickly as well. So I haven't explored them in detail. But one thing, for example, I like is like a dice, but an ordinary dice with 1 to 6. But instead of that being already with story elements associated, that I would just say to the students that I'm with, give me 6, let's say 6 locations. So they just shout out 6 locations, whatever they are, could be farm, forest, whatever. And then one of them rolls the dice. And if it's number 4, it's park, for example. So we've got the location. So in a way, the dice is just taking it's just narrowing down the chance element of what location is and what the 6 characters might be. We might have one character come first of all, so we shake that dice and it's it's a police officer and another, but the story develops by just rolling the dice. But the ideas come from the students, but then the next step is determined by what is rolled on the dice. I don't know. I suppose there's so many different ways of doing it. There's not a no right or wrong.
I think it's just it's the tool to sort of put the skeleton in place, and then it's the human creativity comes around that. Because I mean, like Simona, when we were creating it on the actual AI system, how many versions did we go through? We just went, nope, don't like that. Nope, don't like that. Nope, don't like that. And then we just scrapped the majority of it anyway, because some of it was absolute rubbish. So there was the idea, it was the very basic skeleton, and then it became much more. Creative thought on a computer, they just can't do it.
But yeah, it's a curious world that we're in at the moment with such rapidly advancing technology.
We use what we can to make our job more engaging and interesting. Yeah.
But like you, Despina, I have kind of largely just put all of those more modern things aside and keep going back to the older and older stories and retelling those, because they're just so rich and can be reinvented. They're the stories, as we know, that have been honed by generations, tens, maybe even hundreds of generations of humans. So, what better resource?
There's an idea, David. We could use classical tales, the fairy tales that our students grew up with, and have them, the kids, change them around and see what comes out.
Yeah, of course, yes, and that's a popular activity and can be very. So you mean often like resetting the traditional story in a current context or in an imaginary context.
Reversing roles, etc.
Role reversals.
Yeah.
Well. Yes, absolutely.
As long as we have creative ideas, it's fine.
Yes, too true.
Well, it was very nice to see you today, guys. I'm so glad we did this. Thanks for having us, Simona.
Thank you for coming, Despina and David, and thank you very much for being a good sport? Being a good sport.
Yeah.
You came here and you were marvelous.